Okay, good morning everybody. Thanks for coming to this event. My name is Carsten Jung. I'm the Associate Director for Economic Policy and AI at IPPR. I'm really excited about this event because the way we think about AI in our AI program is very much looking at the downstream impacts of artificial intelligence on the economy and on society. So there's lots of fantastic organizations that work on AI risks and AI governance and AI ethics, and that's really, really important. The niche that we look at IPPR, and really it's not a niche because it's very vast, is even if we get safe AI that doesn't make stuff up all the time, it might be very transformative to a lot of areas of everyday life. AI models in many areas are already better than the average human, whether that's reading, literacy, to PhD marks questions. And so even if we just get widespread adoption of existing AI, it could fundamentally change the labor market, it could fundamentally change the way news and information is distributed. It could have very, very impact on people's careers and lives. And that's the kind of angle we look at IPPR, because we think policy needs to be much more on the front foot in directing these kind of impacts. And we need to be much more deliberate about what kind of system do we actually want to build with this powerful technology. And so we're looking at various aspects of this in our work, but we were quite excited to look at media and the information ecosystem first, and therefore doing this panel, because it's so upstream of a lot of other things, right? If we don't get democratic debate and political deliberation right, a lot of the other policy areas will fail as well, and sort of disinformation and polarization is just one example of how the public sphere is to some extent fracturing and not working, and we're not having kind of the type of debate and interaction with each other that perhaps we need for democracy to function. So we're kind of interested in this intersection between online news, digital media, and sort of what AI could do to this, both in a bad way, but also are there opportunities for actually a more enlightened debate rather than a more polarized one. And we have a really, really great set of speakers to discuss this from various angles. So on my left, we have Matt Rogerson, who is the Director of Global Public Policy and Platform Strategy at the Financial Times. He's at the FT since 24 and thinks a lot about sort of the impact of AI on their business model. Before that, he was at The Guardian, running their live events. He also co-chairs The Guardian's internal working group, or co-chaired, I would think, the working group that has developed the principles on which generative AI would be considered for deployment within the business, and does that at the FT now as well. He's worked with many governments, both in the UK and abroad. worked in various media outfits, including Virgin Media, and takes a keen interest in the way policy shapes the media environment. So very esteemed, and will have lots to say on how business models by media companies will be affected. Then on my left is Azura Moors, who is the policy lead at Full Fact, where she leads on policy and engagement in Parliament, and has a focus on online misinformation and honesty in politics. And a lot of the work, Full Fact is obviously a fact-checking organization, but a lot of the policy thinking comes from Azura. So really, really excited to have you here. And then finally, Roa Powell, who is our lead on AI at IPPR. She sort of runs the program and focuses on the kind of things I was just saying, like what are these positive scenarios for the information environment, but we'll also be looking at AI in health and where, what kind of policies we need to actually bring about, not just preventing the bad things from happening, but also bring about a more positive AI future. Great, so let's get cracking with the debate. And obviously, the arrival of powerful generative AI comes in the context of more than a decade of change in the way we consume information. Many of them good, a lot of them also worrying, including disinformation and polarization. So I was wondering, Azura, if you could maybe set the scene a little bit of where you see today with news consumption, digital media, and the public sphere.
I should start by saying if you were hoping to see Secretary of State here today, not joining us. Yes, so I work for Full Fact, which is the UK's independent fact-checking charity. How many people here have heard of Full Fact? Yeah, it's a voting voting age and that introduces voting age to 16. But actually what it also does is looks at election infrastructure as a whole. What that bill does is gives us an opportunity to start to think about how does AI-generated misinformation start to impact the way people are voting. And really that's, I think, the first place for us to start when we're looking at misinformation broadly. The landscape has changed, the environment has changed, people consuming information has changed. But really when we're thinking about moments of crisis, moments where people don't know what to believe, they don't know what to turn to, an election is a really good moment to look at as well. So that's my opening overview. I think there's lots we can talk about of the risks too. And I'm sure we're all a bit concerned but a bit optimistic in what can be done about this.
Great, thanks very much. And I saw there's sort of an IPCC style organization for the information environment, AI in the information environment, that did a report this year who found that in the elections of the last year, 4 in 5 saw extensive use of AI, including AI content generation. It's not a futuristic potential, and this is happening. AI is being used in elections. Let's in a minute get into what we can do about it. But Matt, I'm curious to hear how things look from the sort of commercial side, from a news producer like the FT.
I like to be optimistic, but no, I share the optimism. I think AI can be really helpful in terms of like transforming existing content into different forms of content and also different audiences. For example, the FT does free access to 16 to 19-year-olds of all of our journalism through an education establishment. If you could take that journalism and transform it into the kind of content that could be better understood by different age groups, that's a really interesting idea. But you do need that underlying journalism to be created in the first place. You do need journalists to do the reporting in the first place in order to create the journalism that can then be transformed by AI models. And I think that's where the current kind of structure is challenged by the way in which AI has been developed at the model level, but also how AI continues to be used on a day-to-day level to scrape journalism and to use that journalism to found AI models and live information. Because ultimately, we talked a little bit about the search and social age. There is an argument, there was a transfer of value in the search and social age, and it's sort of the web owner's choice, the website's choice. You can kind of partake and distribute your content via Google or via Facebook platforms. The kind of AI age is different in the sense that whether you want to distribute your content via AI or not, it's being scraped every day by some of the biggest companies, but also by third parties who then sell that journalism to AI developers for use in model grounding. So we need to fix that, and there are ways in which we can do that, which I'll come on to in a bit. But obviously, there's no value returning back to the people who create professional journalism. There isn't a business model for journalism, and that's quite bad, I would argue. I think it's not just people who are subscribers to kind of paywalled news organisations like the FT that should be worried. If you think about integrity of journalism, the kind of integrity of the bits of journalism that are published, this is also a serious challenge. So everyone from kind of BBC, Wikipedia, the FT would have the same concern, which is once journalism is put through an AI model, especially things like AI summaries, there's been studies that show that 50% of the time the outputs that come out of those AI summaries are incorrect in one or other way. And that kind of process of taking a piece of journalism, putting it through the kind of circus mirror of an AI model and spitting it out the other side, it strips the journalism of all kind of cues and integrity and kind of the things that you expect from a piece of journalism that you on the website of a news organisation. And in terms of how it's kind of potentially impacting like Labour's priorities, one of the things we've been looking at is you can ask an AI model for things like share recommendations, and the AI model will scrape the internet and try and find reputable articles from reputable sites like the FT and say, what shares should I invest in? And then it will hit the paywall with the FT because we don't allow those scrapers to go beyond the paywall. So it sort of has like, let's say, 10%, 20% of the story or 20% of the information it needs. What it does beyond that is hallucinate and make things up. So you can ask it for those kind of share recommendations and you'll get some very convincing outputs that say these are the companies that you should invest in. All completely made up and all kind of from household names and sort of AI models. So if you're trying to encourage retail investment in our economy, probably need to fix that. The thing I think is interesting is that politicians are often in a different place to the public. So the public is actually using these tools and is also listening to concerns about the AI models and how they're developed. There's an Ipsos global study which shows that the more you know about AI, the less you trust it because you understand how it's made and you understand its deficiencies. The government's own study over 4 years has shown that the biggest concern that the UK population has around AI deployment in the public is the quality of news and information. And Reuters Institute have found that about 85% of the public are concerned about news and information environment in the world of AI. So the public gets it. I'll say politicians don't quite yet, but that's what we're trying to talk to them about. In terms of what a regulatory environment could look like, I think there's 3 principles that we'd be keen to see put into practice. One is transparency, the second is attribution, and the third is choice and control. In terms of transparency, I think it's important to empower consumers to know what are AI models trained on, what content is in their model, what are they ground on a day-to-day basis. We need regulators to understand how the same thing, so how are these companies shaping the news agenda that we consume every day? We wouldn't let Pravda be sold in a newsagent underneath a Telegraph's front page, and we shouldn't expect that from our AI models in terms of that kind of disinformation and influence. And we've got to remember that models editorialise content that goes into them, so it's not just like they don't take content from A to B, they change it in the middle, and how they do that is really important. Second thing is around attribution. Because they make errors, we always need links back to the underlying content so that consumers can check that the source material that's used in the output. Consumers, they do this a lot, they should be able to verify that stuff themselves. And the last one is choice and control. That's something we don't currently have as website owners. Or individuals actually, so all of your content's been taken by the AI model developers without your consent, or maybe you did consent. We should be able to decide whether we want our content in those models or not. To withhold it from models that are not good and mangle our content, and to forge licensing deals with those that do want to access high quality journalism with those models. So I think that's where we've got to give legal status to things like robots.txt, which I can go into in more detail. It's quite boring. But that's kind of like the denial of scraping protocol that is currently, it's gone their way in law. So I'll stop there and yeah.
Thank you very much. Ro, over to you.
Thank you. So I think Azura and Matt have done a really good job at summarising where we're at now in terms of the threat landscape. So I might try and hopefully that's a bit better. I might try and make some predictions around where we might see some of these threats from AI go next. So first of all, we've got some of the zeroest points around misinformation and disinformation. I think last year the big threat was elections. We saw so many elections across the world, and around the short-term impacts of AI-enabled disinformation were really big. And to some extent, a lot of the research that was done that year showed that yes, AI was used, yes, we saw some really viral deepfakes, but to some extent the threat to the immediate validity of elections was overblown, and other disinformation threats, for example, misinformation coming from the top, coming from senior politicians, were more impactful. But I would caution against that making us underestimate the longer term threat of AI and disinformation, and there are a few different reasons for this. So first of all, even since last year, we've seen the integration of AI into social media platforms, into things like Google, accelerate at a really rapid pace with things like AI Overview, things like Grok on X being used as a fact-checking device. And I think that really gets at the way people are using the social media systems and people every day having AI feed them that information. Secondly, we're seeing AI become quite a lot more persuasive over time. So there's been some really interesting research on this from a range of different people, which show things, for example, like the persuasiveness of AI text is scaling with model size, and it's scaling quite rapidly. And that's something really hard to study, especially because when we care about misinformation, it's often people seeing that information in a crisis scenario where they have no time to react to it. That's really hard to study, but we do know that AI is getting more persuasive. And we know that some of the tools we had quite a lot of hope in to counter this, like content provenance, where you can check, is that human content, is it AI content, aren't progressing at the speed at which we want them to. So I think, all in all, despite last year maybe not being quite so bad as we might have expected, the longer term impacts of AI-enabled misinformation are still really worrying. And then to turn to the other end of the scale of like the production of trustworthy information, I think there's also been a slight shift in what's happening there. So we have a lot of attention in the UK on things like copyright and creators because data, as Matt was saying, can be taken to train models. But now for news, I think the bigger worry actually is that AI is also calling content for kind of live responses to people's queries, and that sort of calling for data is skyrocketing at the moment at a big cost to news organisations. We're also seeing a really rapid rise in the deals being made between big news organisations and AI, where you can kind of sell your data to them and come to some sort of agreement. But those are very shadowy. We don't know what's going on behind the curtain. And it's only a certain sort of local news organisation that can manage to make a deal like that. It's the big prestige brands. For people who news, small-scale journalism, there's really no mechanism to leverage your data with an AI company, sell it and get some profit back. And I think that is quite concerning. And then the other thing, which Matt already mentioned, which I think is really concerning, is Google's new AI features, things like AI overviews. And as a result of those, we've seen a really dramatic drop in people clicking through to news sites, to human-generated news. All of this meaning that we're seeing a rise in AI slop, a rise in the persuasiveness of AI, at the same time as it's becoming harder for people to produce trustworthy news, and it's becoming harder for people to access that news. I think those trends are going to continue to become more worrying.
Fantastic, thanks so much. I want to bounce a few points off you guys, and then open it up to questions in a minute. But I wanted to get a bit more deeply into the point of misinformation in elections. We have AI becoming like super persuasive. One question I had is like, what is actually like this AI misinformation? Can you, Azura, say a bit about how is it reaching people? So is this basically by the traditional social media platforms, and is the regulatory lever then, well, we need to go via these platforms and make sure that they don't amplify false content, or are there sort of other channels, and then it's more on, you know, making sure whatever AI tools are available don't produce misinformation. So curious, how does misinformation reach people in the UK at the moment?
Small question. I think I go back to Ro's point to begin with, just to say why misinformation maybe wasn't as big of a deal in the last election. And I think that's a really interesting place to start, which is we were expecting the 2024 general election here in the UK, and I say here in the UK because it was a big issue globally, to be this big misinformation election, this big election of deep fakes. And actually we saw a bit of Minecraft deep fakes, we saw a few sort of sloppy examples, but actually it was really minimal. And that's really because Labour was pretty much set to win. You know, from about 2 weeks before the end of the general election, the Conservatives put their hand up and gone, it's probably not for us this year. What I think the difference is now is we are basically in an election cycle. If you look around the conference today, yesterday, look at the news, we are already starting to think about 3-4 years' time. Who will lead the Labour Party, who will lead the opposition party, and that's really why this moment is so important. That being said, there still was a lot of AI mess in the last election. I think deep to me is one of the biggest concerns, but actually it's the ability to be able to detect whether something is true or false within a deepfake. So the video content, it's still not great, it's definitely rapidly getting a lot better, but what we really have started to see, the biggest concern is manipulated voice content. And even our fact-checking teams struggle day in, day out to really verify, is this real or not? Even if we're thinking about this conference, the Keir Starmer deepfake that he hates Liverpool has resurfaced all over again. And maybe people in this room might have not heard it, but actually on Facebook, it's going viral, getting hundreds and hundreds of thousands of views. Now, where is this all coming from? Really, this is coming via the social media platforms. And the way in which people get their news is through these platforms. So when we start to think about regulation, I think we do have to start there. I actually think it's a more fundamental question of the word misinformation is a bit spooky at the moment. Kind of influencing what's going on in the US, no one wants to use that word. No one wants to be the person to say there is a misinformation crisis here, because that's seen as suppressing free speech, that's seen as siding with a certain political movement. That is ridiculous. And actually where we need to start is the government going, no, this is a real problem. Because unless we can call it a problem, we're not going to come up with solutions. We're not going to tell platforms there's an issue here. So I think for me that's step one. And let's start with that today. Then I think we need to go to the platforms and see what more they can do. Whether it's a labelling question or whether it's the input of other content bloggers. So obviously, I'm working for a fact-checking organisation. I'm going to say that fact-checkers are a huge component in the solution here. But there's other things too. There's media literacy tools we can look at where we can say to people, have you thought about maybe whether or not this is real content? Have you looked at other sources? Have you taken a moment to think about these things? There's a really interesting study that happened in the EU ahead of their elections, that if there was a label, 93% of people hesitated before clicking on something. That's enormous, 93%. 93% of people might go, hold on, is that real? And I think that's what we want to be doing. We don't want to be taking down content quite as much unless it is actually parroting lies. What we do want is to be giving people extra tools and extra sources to say, are you sure this is correct? Are you sure you've looked at all the other ways in which you can verify something? So for me, that's really important to start.
Thank you. Matt, I wanted to throw it back over to you. So Roa mentioned the deals between big AI labs and news organizations. Maybe there could be improvement in copyright. Can we fix this via just better legal arrangements between content providers that do fact-checking and AI labs and maybe social media platforms, or do we need a bigger change?
Well, I read over the weekend that regulation is the devil's work, according to Steel, so I don't want to go there too quickly. I think there's a lot of road to go in terms of kind of arrangements between AI developers and content owners in terms of striking those licensing deals. The FT is unfortunate we were the first UK publisher to do one with OpenAI. That's kind of model training, but also grounding of their model in live journalism. And some of the very large technology companies don't have any arrangements in place. But there are some really interesting signs coming forward around how that market might evolve in the future. So Microsoft, which is no startup, it's quite a large company. There was a story last week saying that they're thinking about an AI marketplace that would be open for publishers large and small in terms of grounding their models in live journalism. But clearly the sites that will be impacted most by this are ad-funded sites, and the FT generates revenue through its advertising business, but fortunately we're not reliant on kind of clicks and the programmatic ecosystem to drive that. So I think there's a real challenge there. And I think it's really important when you hear kind of calls for the UK to move to things like a Singapore-style copyright system or other kind of copyright system, which isn't what we've got in the UK at the moment, to actually look at other factors in those countries that might mean they don't have the same concerns as us. So the UK, for example, has got a very vibrant and plural commercial music ecosystem. Singapore, every media organisation in that country is state-funded. So you don't have the same concerns about how those news organisations are going to make money as you do necessarily in a vibrant music ecosystem like the UK. So we should look at the whole picture. When a tech lobbyist tells you should change the law in this way or that way, look at the whole picture behind that country's legal system, not just kind of one soundbite from others.
Thank you. Rowan, and then we'll open up to questions. Any reflections on that? And also perhaps, Matt mentioned, should the state take a more proactive role in fostering a diverse ecosystem that has perhaps more local news that's more relevant to people? Can you paint a bit of what's the positive vision for the public sphere?
Yeah, I guess maybe to build off what you said, regulation is seen as the devil's work. I think in this discussion, so often you see news or the information environment pitted against the UK's AI ecosystem. And if you've seen the news recently, the government is going big on growing the UK's AI sector, and that is a really important goal. So I think we need to try to find arguments around why news is valuable from an economic standpoint, and also why protecting the UK doesn't necessarily need to be to the detriment of the UK's AI ecosystem, because news might be a relatively small sector in terms of the direct value it brings to our economy, but the positive externalities, whether it's productivity, boosts from having good information, stability for the markets, holding power to account, are really important, and they mean it's not really a serious option for the UK government to just allow that sector to fall apart. So it needs to find a way to do both, and I think that is possible. And if you look at some of the trade-offs involved in this debate, they're not as simple as they often appear. It's not as simple as either AI growth or a healthy information environment. So, for example, you might look at competition law. A lot of the companies who are really putting the belt on the news companies are big international monopolies, and the UK might want a more dynamic market where its AI companies can afford to buy good data, good news data. If you give news companies more choice in how their data is used by an AI company, that could also be good for fostering growth of smaller UK companies. And similarly with copyright, the trade-offs are really hard, because if everyone has to pay for data, all the data for AI becomes really expensive. It becomes hard for smaller companies to do that, and your big ones, your ChatGPTs, really capture the market because they can get all of that data from news companies. So I would argue that the trade-offs between news and AI aren't that simple, and that gives the government a bit more leeway towards putting in protections for the information environment in such a way that still supports quite a dynamic market and support for startups and scale-ups to do more with AI in a positive way for the news. And then we might see some more positive use cases of AI and personalization of news, which would be really exciting.
Thanks very much. Okay, we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. Sorry, this is quite a short session. So maybe let's just collect a few and then we go around the panel. Kirsten, in front here.
Hi there, I'm Alex Stepney from News UK, one of the prestige brands that's managed to do a couple of deals. I'm just interested in the views of panelists around the question about morality. So, Carsten, just to go back to what you were saying at the beginning, what's important is that we have debate, that we have deliberation around things, that we don't just have a single version of the truth. And I just wondered if panelists have any reflections on that beyond the points that you've already made about sustainability of the press, and also the issues that you're raising around this information.
Thank you. Let's take a few more. Gentleman over there.
Thank you. Richard Mollick from RELX. A similar point, really. I think the arguments against regulation are very clear. The Online Safety Act shows the difficulty of regulating around content. Isn't the answer in this area then just a sort of authoritative labelling? You have brands like the FT, the Times, Elsevier, LexisNexis, and our world. As long as people know where there's genuine information, they will find it, the market will signal it, and then the rest it's caveat emptor out there, but if you try and regulate it, we've seen it's an absolute no.
Thank you. Yeah,
Hi, my name is Tilly Smith. I'm from Generation Rent. We have done a lot of work around electoral engagement and democracy, and private renters are one of the most underrepresented groups in our elections, and specific groups that can still include. There's it's all sort of, so would argue, well, it's sort of talking about AI and how sort of important and also useful it could be. But sort of people that we represent and work with have some very practical sort of material and sort of social factors that are stopping them from engaging with elections democracy more fully. We're hoping with the elections bill introducing automated voter registration, that's going to help things and get more private renters onto the ballot, onto the electoral register. But I guess my question to the panel is, how do we sort of navigate those more sort of practical and material issues and sort of alongside more sort of innovative things like AI and technology?
Great, thanks. Thanks very much. We actually have a bit longer. I got my timings wrong, so we can maybe start with those 3 questions and then go for another round. So maybe, Rob, why don't you start?
Yeah, I can start by considering the point you made around plurality, which I think is really important. I think that's one of the points where I think the Microsoft thing you mentioned is one, but there are lots of different attempts at the minute to support different sorts of news organisations who might have less resource to try and sort of set out their rights against the AI companies, and one of those is from Creative Commons, because Creative Commons, I think, have always been fighting against the idea that concerns about copyright lead to everyone putting their content behind a paywall, destroying the open internet, which has that plurality of sources. So I think there's some really interesting work there around how organisations, the tools and the international standards they might need to kind of stand up to the big AI companies, the big tech platforms, and make sure their content is there and there's a plurality of sources. I think another question I'm really interested in is, as people go more directly to AI for news, so far it's quite a small market of people who go direct to your chatbots to get their news, but that is growing rapidly. And as soon as that's starting to happen, I think we need to look a lot more in detail, this is something we're hoping to do, at who's getting cited, who are the hyperlinks, and is it a plurality of different organisations who are being included? Is there some level of personalisation so that different people are getting different news? And how might that fracture the information ecosystem, or potentially lead to positives if people get the sources they need first? And then maybe to touch also on the question around, is regulation a bad tool to use for this? I think not always. I think there are different forms of regulation, and there are definitely some examples here which could be working in a simpler way. So I think one of the pillars Matt mentioned was transparency. And often in this fight, as it stands now, smaller news organisations, small AI companies would be in a much better position if there was just a regulation mandating transparency for AI companies. So, for example, if an AI company is crawling your data, they don't actually necessarily always declare the name of the bot that's crawling it, which means if you're a news organisation, you can't use that non-legally binding robots.txt declaration to say, no, leave my data alone, because you don't know who to tell to leave your data alone. So I think there are simpler, narrower forms of regulation which wouldn't get us into such muddy waters as the Organising Act with this, and we shouldn't assume that regulation is unviable.
Maybe let me put it over to Matt. But yeah, you've looked a lot into these questions, right? Which one?
Yeah, I think, look, it was the Labour government that passed the Communications Act, it was the Labour government that passed the Enterprise Act, and the Labour Party has traditionally been worried about concentrations of power in media. Seems to have disappeared at the moment because there's sort of an offer of building some data centres. I'm hoping that that will come back because it is really important. If you get 3-5 companies who aren't based in the UK, don't pay tax in the UK, who are then in control of kind of like public debate around news, that seems to be quite a dangerous place for the UK to get to. At the very least, we need to be able to switch between different AI models and take your data between different AI models if consumers sense that they're being pushed in one direction or another. I think Richard's point on labelling, that's incredibly important. I think I'd say there's a real challenge there in terms of the use of trusted journalists and trusted brands to dupe people. Like, there have always been scams online. I think they're getting easier to purchase. So, Martin Wolf, who's our chief economics consultant, he recently deepfaked on Instagram, on Facebook. His deepfake was telling people to get involved in an investment group. It was pushed by paid posts on Meta, so the criminals were using kind of the tools that advertisers use. Once you got into the group, which I did, I went in there, you were then quite quickly exposed to what looked like convincing information, again I think probably AI generated, and then probably a couple of hours later you get sort of somebody saying, how can I help you with your investment priorities? And then that gets quite persistent. So you've got sort of old forms of scams which are then being sort of really accelerated by the use of generative AI to create all the bits of convincing material that go around the outside of it. And that deepfake of Martin Wolf was up on Meta platforms for a month before it took action. So if you think about that in an election cycle, like we're constantly in election cycles, you say, but that's not acceptable for those sort of videos to be up on the platform for a month. So there needs to be sort of stronger laws there to kind of make sure that there's an impetus on these organisations to do better. Ultimately, I think brands will only survive if, again, you have that kind of view on what is an acceptable output from an AI model. There needs to be a transparency about where the underlying information comes from. If there's a source there needs to be a click back to the original article, and that needs to be prominent, not just kind of somewhere way down the page where you can't see it. And that's the only way I think consumers can be assured that what they're reading is correct at the source.
Yeah, if I can come back on the sort of deepfakes point, we've seen a similar thing to that, but not just on scams and fraud, but on the health front as well. So really reputable doctors coming and saying, you should take this medicine, you shouldn't take this treatment. Those are really, yes, I mean, those are really, really risky things. And I think actually what we have started to experience, particularly since the Trump administration has come back for their second term, is a desire to remove authoritative voices from platforms. So one of the things that Google did quite recently, and quite quiet, I would say, is they removed something called claim review, which really does affect because it actually affects a lot of news organisations as well, where certain reputable sources are boosted in the Google search, and essentially if you searched, for example, does paracetamol cause autism, if a reputable source like Full Fact or EFT had said, no, that's not true, that would be amplified in Google search. Now that has now been completely removed because there is this quite clear move from tech companies to say, no, we don't want one person or one organisation more prominence than another. On both sides, of course. I think from my perspective, there has to be a clear need for regulation, but there also has to be a clear understanding that there are certain sources that have taken the time to look at sources, verify sources, talk to experts, abide by certain journalistic standards that mean actually, if you are searching something harmful, does paracetamol cause autism? Should I be, can I use a paper vote in an election? Going to Tilly's question, how do I look at automatic voter registration? Those should be amplified in a Google search so people know where to look. And the move currently is going completely the other way.
Maybe we can also in the last round of comments get a bit more into what steps can we take to address some of these things. We've touched on a few of them already, but be keen to think about, say, do we need new regulation, or can we do a lot within the online safety bill or other legislation? So keen to get into the solutions, but I wanted to throw it back to the audience for some more questions. Gentleman over here on the right.
Thanks. Hi, Jeff Barrett, Councillor, City of Westminster. We talked a lot about journalism, but people are using AI extensively for their personal relationships, to ask advice, finances, how's my job doing, should I ditch my boyfriend or girlfriend? This is the kind of relationship people are having with them now. They'll be asking, after they've built this relationship, which candidate should I vote for? Should we regulate that?
And then we have, let's go in the front.
Hi there, my name is Katie Sloan. I work for a legal tech company called Vala. We use AI to help people enforce employment law rights. There's been a lot of really interesting discussion around generative AI. I'm quite interested in AGI, and a lot of experts saying that within the next 5 to 10 years we could have AI that's better at most things than humans. And just how that sort of impacts this question of democratic debate and kind of risks and benefits of AI.
Thank you. Lewis, I'm a councillor working in local government and also around AI. It's been mentioned by the panel around the sort of flagging of artificial intelligence where it's been used. I think the statistic 93% was used where people considered a pause, which is potentially positive. The question I'd like to ask is that enough? You know, when you compare that to, for example, people are using AI for convenience, they want something to be quick. The comparison I'd make is the terms and conditions box at the bottom of the page. How many people stop and read and think when ticking that? So I wonder whether, if long term, that is enough. Short term, perhaps. Long term, we need something more.
Thank you. And then finally, the person over here on the right.
Hi, I'm Lydia from the Centre of Long-Term Resilience. We did some polling recently and we found that 52% of people think that AI tools, including LLMs, are already regulated centrally by the government. As that's not the case, do you think that's kind of like getting to that status quo is going to be the first step to sort of like massively improve people's consumption of these things? I guess anything less sort of like is behind where most people think we already are. So is that the kind of main thing we need, some sort of government regulation that's sort of consumer signalled, like the food industry, something like that, that signals safe AI?
Great, really great questions, and very nicely, a lot of them connected to the what can we actually do in terms of regulation or policy questions. So maybe, Roa, do you wanna kick off?
Yeah, I can take the question about regulation first. I think that really comes home to the fact that the public are in very different positions on this, and we have seen obviously government toying with the idea of an AI bill, which kind of keeps getting pushed back and potentially becoming narrower and narrower to the point where it's addressing the most advanced AI systems and the most extreme risks. And I think we're likely to see a case where if there is an AI bill, I think that would be a really positive development. It might not address a lot of the issues we're talking about today because it would be so narrow that it addresses things like cybersecurity risks from AI or biorisks, all really important things, but a lot of the stuff that's covered by, say, the Online Safety Act and the risks we're talking about here won't necessarily be addressed by an AI-specific bill. So I think, yes, we should do something along those lines, but that might not be enough to get us to the car, and using some of the existing legislation to address some of these risks in the sector would be really valuable as well. The question around should AI answer if you ask who to vote for is really, really tricky, both from a philosophical perspective and a technical perspective, because if you're an AI company and you're safety training your model, sometimes you'll find these strange effects where if you train it to not answer certain questions about politics, it can, by view of that safety testing researchers found, not answer questions that are vaguely right-wing, for example. That's what one piece of research found. So it's really hard to start putting these constraints on what the models will and won't answer without having some unintended side effects, which could have really big impacts on where people are shifting to politically. So I think in an ideal world, we'd have a state where the AI models can answer with fact-based questions. So it would answer, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but here's some information. But is there ever a truly neutral response? So I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. I didn't make a note of one of the other questions. AGI. Yes, I think as AI becomes more advanced in this conversation, it's really hard because the impacts on using the information environment are already pretty extreme, and we do want to address those immediate impacts now. But in the longer term, there's potential for a much larger part of the news lifecycle to become automated, to the point where you have a personal agent delivering you your news, where you have all of this, and there could be really positive aspects of that if everybody gets more accessible information. But I think because policymakers are grappling so much with the immediate term, some of those AGI questions do get forgotten about, and hopefully we can do more to address those.
I'm going to start with Lydia's question about should there be a sort of consumer AI understanding? And I think we've been thinking a lot about regulation, particularly those of you who followed the Online Safety Act over the summer and the sort of outrage age verification that came in. And I think, I'm going to say this from my personal perspective, regulation is done best when the public doesn't really know about it. When people start to think, this regulation is infringing on my free speech, it's infringing on my understanding of something, that causes the problem. Actually, it should just be done well behind the scenes in a way that the public doesn't really see a difference. That you might say, oh look, there's, this the way in which I engage with this content is slightly different. They don't actually feel like they're having to do additional work to get onto it, for example. They're not having to, verify things to go onto ChatGPT. So personally, I think if the public thinks, regulation is happening, that's probably fine. And actually, it's for people here in this room, it's for policymakers to try and think a bit more about what we can do that doesn't infringe on people's understanding of things, but also does make things stronger, safer, going forward. I think I totally agree with Ro about the question on should we, block people from asking questions about what candidate should I vote for, and I'm definitely not in the work of saying no, we should stop them saying that, because I think that is ethically, morally wrong. But I do think there has to be caveats that says, you have to make your own mind up in an election. You have to look at good sources. Here is, the manifestos of all the major parties running. You probably need to have a look. But that being said, that's really tricky. So I think it's about what more can be done around that question that gives people access to good information. And, I mentioned at the beginning, we're thinking a lot about lowering voting age. Currently, 13, 14-year-olds will be voting for the first time in a couple of years. They will be starting to ask those questions. So if they aren't getting protections from the AI models, we need to do further regulation in schools, for example. We need democratic lessons to tell people how and why to vote. They're not getting that protection elsewhere. And then Lewis's question about flagging, is that enough? Definitely not. But these things take a lot of time, and I think the more we can do quickly, the better. And if that is a minor thing, that's better than not doing anything at all. Making people a little bit safer is better than waiting 3 or 4 years for a big major AI bill to be put through. So no, it's not enough, but it's definitely better. And it has to be done, in part with everything else that happens around us as well.
So personal relationships speaks to the question of sycophants. I think we haven't really talked about that in terms of the AI models, they kind of get to know what you're into. I think probably there are some AI models that do that more deeply than others, but like in terms of like political views and like what your conversational interests are, and it will kind of bring you more of that stuff that things you like, in a way that kind of, I suppose the Facebook algorithm is the version of that. Except it will also editorialise the outputs, so the way in which you like consuming that content as well. So it's quite a powerful thing. Now how you regulate that in the context of things like politics, we have to think about things like prominence of public interest journalism, or prominence of positive, like high quality stuff in the AI age. In the world of TV, that's done through like prominence on a TV PG. What's the equivalent of that when it comes to things like election information in AI models? It's probably having that AI model grounded on reliable information about politics and candidates in the race. Whether all of the models that are available on the market in the UK would sign up to that is a question. I don't think they would. On AGI, I tend to think a lot of that stuff was to distract people from the realities of what's been happening. I think like the catastrophic discussions of AI launching a nuclear weapon just felt like, a bit of a distraction. It's been used a lot in cyber attacks, obviously, in cyber warfare. That's all completely real. The AGI thing feels like it's really a message for investors about the end of the road and why they're pouring billions into this technology. A lot of kind of AI scientists who I think are respected in the field who I've read stuff from suggest that AGI isn't quite as close as some of the boosters make out. And then obviously like AI models, in terms of regulation, they should be regulated. They are regulated. So in data protection terms, there are questions about whether the ICO in the UK has done enough about all of the scraping that's occurred to make the models in the first place. They've basically been told, I think, to stand back and not really look too deeply into what's happened, would be my guess. But they should be, and I think the public would expect that. In competition terms, clearly the CMA is taking interest. They've got an investigation at the moment with their new powers under the Digital Markets Act, where they're looking at whether Google is designated. I think that would make a big impact if they were, and it's kind of websites, for example, as I say, have the choice of control about whether to allow their content to be used for these different AI-related purposes.
Great, thanks very much. We have time for last round of questions, and I already wanted to use my privilege as chair to add one to them, to ask you to do a bit of navel gazing. When you think of 2028, and AI progress continues roughly along the lines we've seen, how do you think people will consume media? And actually, let me rephrase it slightly. What is a positive scenario of how people will be consuming media? It might include the role of brands that do verification, might include fact-checking, might include wider views on who produces content. But there is a transformation happening. If we get all this right, how does it look like in 4 years or so? So that's one question I'd like to ask. Any more questions from the audience in addition to that? Yeah, one more over there.
It's me again, but I guess I have a kind of response to the idea that regulation should be behind the scenes. I think there's a big argument that AI literacy needs to be improved to the general public because they won't use AI if they don't have trust in it, and that comes from knowing more about it. I guess I kind of see some sort of label akin to like consumer-facing label as a way of sort of generally uplifting and increasing AI literacy, sort of creating like a subliminal choice in people's minds. They can choose like something that's regulated and sort of signaled or not, as a way of sort of starting to improve that. And like you said, things like fair trade are in the school curriculum, so it's like another way of kind of getting people to choose between a good and a bad actor, I guess, in a way. So do you think there's space for like an external consumer-facing certification, and then this kind of like behind-the-scenes, more sort of regulatory landscape that people aren't aware of?
Thank you. More questions? Then let's start with Matt.
Yes, I was at a conference last week where we were talking about AI supply chains. And if you think about, in other industries, we think about, so Red Tractor is a good example where we allow consumers to make a choice based on the quality of the supply chain that sits behind it. Same is true with clothes, right? When we discovered that low price fast fashion retailers were using supply chains that are lethal, we did something about it. Like we introduced kind of supply chain legislation to stop that from happening. There is a reluctance in this space to do that because there is this kind of like political quid pro quo around data center investment, which means that politicians are scared about having that conversation. But I think transparency and like being clear about who's done the right thing in terms of model training and grounding is that right, because there is a tech. If you're a trusted user organisation, you stop an AI model from scraping your content. As I say, they might get like halfway. They might read half an article to the paywall, and after that, the model will, because it has to fulfil the request, it'll just make up the rest of that stuff. So you need to know whether it has actually got access to that content or not. Your question about where we'll be, I think I'm hopeful. So from our perspective, a lot of our business is business licensing. What we're seeing is a lot of clients are upgrading their licenses to include things like AI summarization. So what businesses that make decisions based on journalism derived data from our journalism is that they want to guarantee that stuff that's in their AI model is like journalism written by humans, is then interpreted by an AI model, and that they can then use to make business decisions. My hope is you'll see more of that. You'll see more of the kind of business world going, actually, it's a useful summarization tool. I mean, media monitoring is a useful summarization tool, but would you spend billions on media monitoring? I don't know. But more and more people will do that. And that kind of like bring your own license to the party type idea, I think that hopefully will get some traction on the business side and also on the commercial side. Because I think the position we need to get to is where the AI tools are based on their capabilities and not how much content they can nick. So that's the kind of like that interoperable nature is the future I would see.
Yeah, going back to that fair trade question, it is really interesting. And to be honest, it's not something I've thought about a ton. So if you have more thoughts, I'd love to hear them. I think the only thing I would say back to is does it make you forget the fact that so much of what's happening in the information environment is happening to us without us really being able to make a choice. So, when we go onto Google search and we get summaries of top sources, we're not really able to sort of think about whether or not it has a good fair label because it's just happening. It's just happening to the information environment. How people consume news it's really out of our control in so many things. So I think it sounds like a great idea, and I think going back to Matt's point, anything that uses transparency is obviously a win. I just don't know how practical it would be to work at scale. And I think for something to really make a big difference, we have to do a big wholesale reform to have it work. I think the point about what do we want for 2028, I think it's a great point about this one, so I'll talk a bit more about how the consumer might get AI, but I think going back to my original point of opportunities, that say 2028, we're a year out from the election, we're seeing AI used in a way that's helping inform people. So there was a really great example in the US that one senator candidate translated all of his campaign videos to multiple languages, and it allowed a much larger population to understand what he was saying. We can do stuff like that here in the UK for the elections. So long as it is labelled fairly, so long as it is accurate, I see no issue with that. So to me, what I'd like to see in 2028 is a clear, widespread understanding of here to diverse and plural sources, multiple standards that have to get to that level of change.
Going to start on public scale, which I should have said this, is public procurement has a huge impact on industries. The government has a huge role in terms of what does it procure in terms of AI models? Does it procure AI models that have a good supply chain, or does it procure AI models that have got a bad supply chain? And I think you're going to see over the next few years these companies are going to move further and further and closer to different parts of government. So they're already getting into that education, AI for education. It would be a travesty, I think, if the government was contracting out using economic spy tools that don't license content or scrape content without permission, and that would get a bad outcome, a bad use of state power.
Yeah, we have a report out actually, the direction of AI innovation in the UK, which talks a lot about the importance of procurement. So check it out. Anyway, I feel very uplifted, and I hope you are too. Please stay in touch. We're going to do a lot more work on this. Email us, talk to us after, come to our future events. But thanks very much for coming. Thanks to all the panelists. Fantastic discussion, and see you around.
Okay. Certainly.